Welcome back to the Expanded Minds podcast. Today, I have a special guest with me, and her name is Violet. Violet is an intuitive artist and interior designer, and also has a passion for non duality teachings. Violet also has a YouTube channel called Violet Synergy, where she shares non dual talks and poetry, guided meditations, and intuitive art. So, for the people looking for freedom and full expression, Violet's perspective on reality will help you shift your perspective and ultimately expand your mind.
Nice.
With
Thank
that
you.
being said, welcome on.
Yeah. I'm not doing my interior design stuff anymore, but that was a big part of my life before this path.
hmm So where I want to start out with this is
Yeah.
when you first got into non-dualism, and so when you first got into it, you were going through relationship struggles, and then you were going through a depression, and then from there you got into an acting class where
Mm.
you met someone named Angelo,
Mhm.
and he introduced you into these dualistic teachings and stuff.
Sure.
And so talk to me about the awakening you had where it was like the middle of the night and you woke up, you looked yourself in the mirror, and
Mm.
you saw yourself very differently. So tell me a little bit about that awakening and how those teachings, uh, awoke something in you and stuff like that.
Totally. Yeah. So it was that was a part of the awakening, maybe 24-hour period, the mirror part. So to back up just a little bit, there was yeah, coming out of a 8-month depression, starting to studying acting just because I don't know why really. It just sort of arose in me. I studied a little bit many years before, but so that just sort of like piqued my interest. And then meeting Angelo, and he told me about Audio Shanti and Jeff Foster specifically. And so I was listening to Jeff Foster's book, The Deepest Acceptance, all the time. I was traveling a bit, and so I would listen to it, the audiobook on the airplane. I would listen to it as I was falling to sleep. And he also told me, so that book and also um, The End of Your World from Adyashanti were the two audiobooks that really struck me. And then wasn't really necessarily at that time into YouTube and the videos there quite yet. It was mostly just those two audiobooks. And then Angela had also told me, sit and ask, who am I? And so I sat on my balcony most all of the day, and I had a lot of free time at the time. So I just would sit and ask, who am I? And then I did that for 4 months. And then after that, at some point, I got up from my chair, and it was the evening. It was my evening meditation, and I got up from my chair and just felt really different. There was it was on my balcony, so I was outside, and there was this really beautiful tree in my backyard that was relatively really close to the house anyways. But then there was the moon, and then that we were my house was near a busy street, so I could hear all the cars, and um, it just felt like everything was really close. And I just got up from my chair, and I touched the railing on the balcony, and it just felt different, and it felt I could see the moon, and it just felt like the moon and myself were the same. I couldn't really explain it. It just felt like so intimate and so beautiful, like a fresh breath of air. Um, and I didn't really know what awakening was, to be honest. I didn't know what I was looking for. It just made sense for me to sit and ask, who am I, especially with my explorations with acting at that time. And so then, yeah, from there, I kind of just slowly like eased into the house and into like evening routine. And I remember looking in the mirror, and my husband had moved away and we were separated, but we had a closet that was like a hallway, and it had a mirror on each side. And so you could see the whole closet if you looked in the mirror. And so all of his clothes, all of my clothes, and um, yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if I guess maybe this is an important part to note is there was a lot of my marriage that like we would travel and I would like match our outfits, and I really loved like like a part of our expression was the clothing aspect, and so we had this like beautiful closet full of these outfits, ultimately these costumes, and that was all I spent my time doing prior to us being separated. So it was really fun and important for me. And then, so I look in the mirror and yeah, it just felt like, whose closet is this? Um, and it just felt really mysterious and really opened a curiosity in me beyond what I could understand. So I just sat there on the floor in the closet and stared in the mirror and just was really curious, what was I looking at, what was looking, and what was all of this. And then I just eventually had went to bed, and then I woke up the next morning, it was, it felt like it just kept getting more and more, like the awakening was sort of started that evening into the mirror sort of part of that journey, and the next morning it was just like more intimacy. And it just kept becoming more and more intimacy over the next few days. And Angela was away at a Adi Shanti retreat, and so I was texting with him when he was available. And to him, he said it was really clear that it was an awakening experience. And yeah, I started writing poetry like that same day. And looking back, actually, I started writing poetry a couple days prior, where I think it was, I talk about that moment, but I think there was a couple days before that that were premature awakening, that were just really like closer and closer and closer, more intimate and more intimate. So yeah.
So what kind of like realizations is about the self, or because you started repeating yourself, like, who am I? Like, were there certain shifts, and within these shifts, you started to get realizations about yourself even deeper and deeper? And if like you did, like, what
Yeah,
were some
yeah.
realizations that you had about, around that question, like, who am I?
Yeah, yeah. So I didn't really know what I was doing asking who am I? So I didn't like, I think if our modern times now, we tell people like as teachers to sit and ask who am I, and we can kind of I can explain what that means a little bit more, like what that's about or how to do that. But for me at that time, I didn't have that. I didn't for whatever reason I didn't ask Angela why to do that. I didn't like I don't know. It was a question that sort of struck me deeper than conceptual questioning. And I also not really a conceptual person. So it just felt right to do that. So I didn't really know why I was doing it. But yeah, what started to happen was I think in the meditations of who am I, it started to create more space. The thoughts would quiet more, and so it would just be more space. And in that space, what arose was these old memories that I hadn't thought about in years, that were quite traumatic, to be honest. And so I don't know, I just intuited to because the balcony where I sat was right off of my master bedroom. So like it would just bring up these old memories of trauma, of childhood, of really terrible things that had happened that just like really struck my heart. And I just would go to my bed and cry and lie there and process it however I could. And it would most likely be some sort of put me to sleep, put the body, like it would just, if it was like full expression, with these memories and these emotions, that it just would put the body to sleep. And then I would wake up and my body would be calmer again. And I would like eat or something. And then I would go and sit again. And I was sort of doing this like practice all day. And so I wasn't really necessarily seeing into the nature of what I am or not. In some way, I have another example of that. But a lot of it was just like, it brought up the space and the availability in me to really process things that weren't deeply processed before, because I had to keep my life going. And now I didn't have anywhere to be. So I could. And also I had more just space and consciousness to be able to process. And then, yeah, there was a couple of times where I realized, like, because I didn't know what I was asking when I was asking, who am I? And then I realized that I'm a lot of things, or what I think I am is a lot of things. And I felt like I just like had this like a lot of personalities. I'm like, okay, when I'm with my husband, I'm a different person, and I'm playing the right wife role. When I'm with my dad, I'm the daughter role, and and so I remember texting Angela one day and saying, I'm not. I kind of subconsciously thought asking him I was looking for something that I am that I would find that is real or something. And I realized that I couldn't find who I am because who I am appears differently in these different circumstances of my life, these different careers, these different relationships, these different things in my life that I wasn't that what I think I am is a whole lot of things. And so that was kind of insight in a way, and really interesting to start realizing that. Um, yeah, yeah.
Did you ever so when you open up that space for yourself, did you ever feel like you were almost getting vacuumed into yourself in a sense, or like you're entering a void or anything like that?
Mm,
Did
mm.
that happen to you?
Um, it felt like I was merging with something in some way, I could say. Yeah. I don't know that I would call it a void or vacuuming into anything, but it did feel like somehow space felt like it was getting bigger and bigger, and there was something I was merging with, something that I was expanding into. Mhm.
Do you know what that is still, or is it do you
Um,
know what you're merging with, or is it still unknown?
it's still a mystery. Yeah, yeah. I think it's changed quite a bit. I mean, this awakening, initial shift was, almost 6 years ago. So, it's definitely changed quite a bit in its, maturity.
Mm.
But yeah, it's still a mystery. Yeah.
Do you experience like these so like the different roles, for example, that you find
Mm,
yourself playing?
yeah.
Do you experience them as like you could say energy forms, or like energy? How do I describe this? Like when you're viewing these roles that you're playing out, for example, wife, and you're seeing yourself psychologically playing. Are you seeing yourself like psychologically playing out these roles in like an energy body as you're like observing it, and you're realizing, oh, this is me playing the role of a wife? Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. I don't I don't think I felt that at the time or thought of it that way in that time. I wasn't really as clear as I am more so now on energy in that way. I think I was very susceptible and very in tune with energy, but I don't think I had any understanding of it, um, or had any sort of reflection in that way. And then now now that I do in a different sense, it would it, I don't feel the roles in the same way. So it's kind of hard to
Uh,
answer that.
so if you don't feel the roles in the same way, like how do you experience, like you could say you've done acting too, so like how do you
Mhm.
experience role play and like experiencing all that kind of stuff?
Um, it doesn't feel like there's a role being played. It just feels like an expression happening. An energy expressing, you could say. It's not defined by anything, like, we can call it different things in afterthought, but it doesn't really feel like as it's expressing, it's really being called anything, and I think that was always the case, but I wasn't as clear on what a thought actually is, and what thought reality is, and what reflective consciousness is, as I am now. Like, to me, experientially, that's really clear that there's just words coming out now. There's just this expression now. And it doesn't feel like it's coming from anywhere or owned by anything or defined by anything, though I can see the reflective thought clearly that it could say anything. It could be saying, Violet's having a conversation explaining something about something in time with Ezekiel right now. And that's a beautiful way that the mind can reflect something, but it ultimately isn't that. And it doesn't feel like that. It's just clear to me that there's not taking the reflection to be any sort of buy-in to that reflection. It's just something that's also expressing in this time, in this moment.
That's a good way to put it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And so during that awakening process, like what do you think, or just from having certain points in time where you experience maybe an expansion or whatever, like what do you think is the most important thing to focus on as you're having these experiences?
Well, it really depends on which sort of where you're at. Like when I work with people now, it just really feels like um, there's not really a certain, there's not really a predictable stage per se, but um, there's things that can be oriented to that needs like the intuition of that person I'm working with and my own intuition um, to be sort of um, dancing to figure out what is being overlooked now, what is being fixated on right now, and how to clarify that. So I guess in reflection of that, maybe an important thing to focus on it if somebody's on the path is having somebody that you can have true reflection with and true trust in it. And it could be a teacher, a friend, a guide in some way, because there's so much of this that the mind, we there's a lot of YouTube videos now. There's a lot of teachings out there, which is really beautiful, but we have to also sort of, you know, acknowledge and be clear on the fact that how the mind works and how it will grasp and make a reality out of something, how it will grasp a reflection of a teaching or what somebody said. And that can be useful, but it's also like we need to be aware and clear on the mind is doing that, while there could be some insightful things and some energetic transmission and things that are helpful in somebody's teaching online and so forth, but also the mind is constantly making into some linear thing. I'm here and I need to get here, or this is what they're saying, or people listening to this will be interpreting these words however their mind interprets these words through their set of conditionings, right? So their body mind is conditioned a certain way, your mind is interpreting them a certain way, right? That's going to be different for person to person. So with that said, I think it's really important to have somebody that you can have clear, honest reflection with, because ego is very easy to co-opt a lot of things on this path. So yeah, and develop and developing intuition, however that happens. Yeah.
So like each person has their own set of, identities that they cling to, their own concepts that they have, or their own egos formed in a certain way. So when you work with each person, it's more like like you could say like an intimate experience where they discover
Mhm.
their own selves and learn how to let go of these certain identities. And so
Yeah.
like, how do you find that somebody, how do you find out that somebody has a certain identity that they cling to very closely? Or like, how do you find out these things when you work with people, or how do they discover it themselves?
Yeah, I think it's, a lot of intuition, really, like, to me, it always comes back to that, and it comes into feeling directly, so that's why I love to just sit with somebody and feel, indirectly, and so it to me, like, if something is fixated or, an emotion's not processed or being repressed, it shows up in the sensory experience, and so, a lot of sessions are video, and so it's being open here to feel, to really look, to observe. And it's not like my mind is necessarily making judgments of what I'm seeing, how somebody moves, or how I'm seeing if somebody's listening to somebody sharing a part of their story or where they're at or anything like that. But it's more like I don't. It's interesting. I can feel it in my body. So it's like, um, and that to me feels like the ongoing work that I do here in my own process is to know these places of um, they're ultimately really energetic places, but to know all emotion in both forms, in full expression and in full contraction. And so to know all emotion, each one individually in myself, in full expression and full contraction, it just makes it easier to naturally recognize when that's happening in someone else. To know all thought forms, all identity forms in both expression and repression. So it's like the spectrum. And to know both of those, to know all it or as many as I can, through it processing here. And I don't claim to know all of the thought identities or all of the ways. I think I'm really clear, and I keep going to these places and knowing what these energies are. Ultimately, the thoughts, expressions, or repression, or emotion, or energies, they're all energy. So to really like dive in and explore them in my own body mind is again and again, it's like an ongoing thing, allows me to recognize those patterns in other people. And also working with people over time. Like it just started to become really obvious because there is some predictable sort of movements of how it moves. Like the certain identities, I just know how it feels, how they feel when they're moving. So when I'm with somebody and we're talking in this way and we're working in this way, I can feel it in my body. It's not like I'm in their body feeling for them, but I can feel that thing in my body. And it's not like I could write it down and tell you how it feels or express it. It just it's just a knowing that's beyond it's beyond Violet. It's like, and it's intuition. It's a knowing, and it moves in a certain way, and it knows how to respond. And so, like, if I'm with somebody, for example, and I can feel like I start feeling this like energy in my chest or something, I'm not like, I'm not like, there's something going on in your chest and you're not feeling it, like, because I recognize it might be repressed in what I'm feeling, but I just sort of tune their attention to, like, do you feel something going on in your chest? Do you feel an energy there? And then we explore it together, because I don't take the way it feels for me to be the accurate way. Like, I'm not assuming that I'm feeling it more correctly than they are, but it's like it tunes my attention to start exploring that space with somebody. And I think it's really powerful. We're both exploring this sensation in the chest. And then we can together clarify what it may be going on and what arises from giving it attention. It sort of just expresses itself. It tells us ultimately. So I don't know if that is helpful or clear.
Yeah, that makes sense. But okay, you talked about like identities, like the emotions being contracted, expanded. Like, what exactly would be an example of a expanded versus contraction
Mm,
kind of
mm.
thing?
So, a common one, which would probably be a good example here, and that we can all sort of feel into, whoever's listening to this, would be disassociation. I think, it's clear to me that disassociation is a really common movement, energetically and with inside consciousness, um, for all humans. It's just like such a fundamental quality of our conditioned nervous systems, our conditioned body minds. Um, and so disassociation specifically feels like, it feels sleepy. It feels like void and dull. It doesn't feel like vibrant and alive. Like right now, I feel this like vibrant, alive expression. It just feels energetic, right? And even putting those words on it is a bit colorful. It's not really that way, but it's a beautiful way to describe it. It's using reflection as close as I could get. It just So disassociation feels like sleepy and dull, and like, um, it has a darker color to it, darker tones, maybe like deeper maroon tones. Like I can see those. I could see colors when I'm feeling that disassociation. I can feel weighted when I feel disassociation. I feel tired. I feel like energy going in a different direction. It almost is like going in this direction versus like alive and colorful. It feels like an outward, it just feels like it's like this kind of vibration. And I feel very awake energetically. I feel like a color. It feels yellow. It feels orange. And so like those are sort of the things that I kind of feel I feel and I see in my movement. Like, talk about it being energetic, like it just feels like it's all energetic in some way and all
Hmm.
sensory in some way. Um, so I think hopefully that's helpful and clear to some people listening, is that like it's a lot about that feeling, and that how is it expressing through the sensory experience. And so disassociation is a really common one, um, that we have before spiritual path, but we also have, it's also called like spiritual bypassing often. So it's a really common one that our nervous systems are triggered into by certain patterns. And so it's a good one to be aware of and know how it feels, and sort of be able to recognize its quality.
Yeah, I call that the colorless light, where it's just like this
Yeah.
clear light, but like you say, on the fringes of that, it's like a rainbowish kind of.
Mhm.
I don't know how to describe it too, but
Yeah.
that's how I experienced it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
So like,
Yeah.
how does from a non-dual dualism point of view, like how do you view the relationship between the self and the ego?
Hmm. Well, I don't know that I necessarily have a view from a non-dualism thing. I get those terms you're using, but I don't
Hmm.
necessarily think of it that way, because to me it feels like I had somebody recently post on one of my videos where I was talking more about like emotional integration and more like the human side of things. That the comment was, that's not non-duality. And so I think that's a good point of contact here, because for me, I don't like think of it like as not non-duality or not non-duality. If I'm honest, energetically, everything feels non-dual. So how could anything not be non-duality? Ultimately, that's how it feels to me. That's not a perspective I hold, but even when I'm in the nitty gritty of disassociation in the human body that feels completely contracted and separate, to me, that is still non-duality. That still feels like non-duality, because it's just clear that there isn't anything that could actually be separate, even though it can be experienced as separate. So it's like spirit or essence or this energy can experience itself as a form of contraction that maybe perceives separately, but it never is actually separate. So, yeah. And then remind me your question. I kind of got a little lost there on
It was
your
just
direct
simply like,
question.
how do you view the relationship between self and the ego?
Self and ego.
And then
Yeah.
I said from a non-dualism perspective, but we can just start with
Yeah, totally. Yeah.
how do you view
So,
self and ego?
um, self to me is a structure. I don't really use it as self. I use it more as, like, I would call it the identity structure, right? And then ego is being identified with inside that structure. So so the self structure isn't necessarily personal, or the identity structure isn't necessarily personal, but the perception of ego, the expression of ego, makes it feel like it is separate. Uh, um, does that make sense? Like, it's sort of like, if I were to describe it as like a box, like, it kind of like identity structure feels like a background structure. And then
Yeah.
within that box, there's what we call ego, that is identified with like a personal stream narrative, excuse me, storyline.
Yeah.
Mhm. And so, and this is just from, I guess, my experience more so than a non-dual perspective. My experience of that is like the, initial awakening is seeing that ego's life path, or that seeming linear timeline of ego isn't what I am. So an initial awakening, and that's what it was seen when we're talking about my first shift that we had previously talked about. And then from there, it feels like the path from um, seeing that I am not this small thing called ego, and yet there's still identity structure that has to be worked out. So it's the path from that initial awakening to what I would call liberation, where the whole entire identity structure dismantles itself. And along the way, if we're talking in these terms, is the falling away of all of the different identities, all of the different ways um, that are ultimately contracted separate energies. So it's, and then that liberation side of things isn't actually the end either. There's further beyond that in my experience. So I don't know if that's accurate as far as what people talk about in non-duality, but that's just how it has appeared here. Um, and it feels very clear. And that's just like, I trust my honest reflection of that.
Yeah, it seems pretty. It's kind of like how I experienced it a little bit. But like
Hmm.
where I learned it from too was like, or at least the way that I learned it was like in a different way. So your awareness faculty is like located in your head. This is where I learned it, or this is how I learned it. It's like you would have in the center of your head your awareness faculty, and then the ego or the identity structure acts as like this dark kind of cloud all over you. So it's kind of like an unconscious, like it puts you to sleep like that. And you
Hmm.
have your awareness faculty in the center of your head. Um, One example, or like when you wake up, for example, it's stored in like next to your heart, the ego structure. And then when you wake up, um, your awareness expands and opens up like that, but then the identity structure comes over and then, you know, comes in with the labels, the constructs, and everything. And so where you start out with, at least where I started out with, is like, was like focusing on the center of my head, and then just observing the identity structure as they come, and
Yeah.
allowing it to slowly start to open up, allowing the awareness faculty to open up, and then slowly those illusions start to shatter and fall
Mm.
off, and then you go into like that clear, colorless kind of mode of viewing things. But
Hmm.
um,
It's
I guess
beautiful.
people experience it in different ways, or like, but it's somewhat similar how you started just like that
Yeah,
box that you get put in, that sleep you get put under. Um,
totally.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. ways of explaining it, and I think it's probably experienced quite similar. We just sort of explain it through, again, our conditioning of our reflective mind, right? Like, what is our conditioning come from? What teachers do we listen to, and all these things? Because, like, ultimately, all of the way we're explaining it through words is reflection. So it's a mystery, right? It's really a mystery how this unfolds, and that's what's really so exciting about it. And yet, and that's why I think it's important to note that, like, to not hang ourselves up on the concepts or how we're explaining it, because then we judge, like, are we having it the right way? Like, how it unfolded for me didn't didn't align with the way that it was being explained through the teachers that I was student of, right? So, like, some of how Angelo explains it, some of it how he explains it did align with how it expressed for me, but some of it didn't. A lot of things I read, it was like, so reading those type of things and then trying to relay where I'm at in that, where it's going on in my experience, led me to doubt, led me to feeling like I'm not having it the right way. I'm not having the right kind of experience. And so, like, at some point, viewing it from that way, it was like, one day, like 3 years in, I was really judging myself and my experience, and then I was vacuuming the living room, and it was like, "Oh," it was just the most obvious thing, like, "Oh, there's no way that this is. It's just what's happening right now." And so all of the ways that I was thinking I was gonna get to it being that way, or I was gonna or the here's how it went, like, I was still taking at that point the reflection to be how it is, or I will find another reflection that will be, uh, that I need to get to, right? So that's sort of a big part of seeking fell away in that moment of, like, there's no way that this is, there's only this the way that it is right now. And that doesn't refer to anything in time, into any other moment. So that was incredibly freeing. And then it just let up a lot of space to really just deepen into my own expression of it, my own experience of it, because it's different and it will be for everyone.
Yeah. Can you tell me like maybe the pull towards emptiness or the pull towards just being? And when are the moments that you felt that like the pull towards emptiness?
Mm. Well, I think it's important to ask, what do you mean by emptiness or being? So I can have a clear reflection there.
It's almost like when you're falling asleep, for example, you start to let go of the day, what happened in the day,
Mm,
um, you know, who you are just in general. Because when you enter into the dream world, you have a whole different experience of what is actually. So
mm,
I mean, you're just letting go of the muscles, the tension in the muscles, and you're slowly letting go and of what all those identifications and stuff, and you're just going towards just pure being, just emptying
mm,
yourself of all those things that you carried out on your day,
mhm,
those thoughts and emotions that you had during the day, just letting it go and letting it lift off, and just going to just a
mm,
stillness.
mm. Yeah, it feels like that's here now. That doesn't, it's not an experience that only arises in sleep or only arises in, I'm not, I can't be clear. I'm feeling the same thing you're explaining, but it feels like that's where this goes. That's what this is. That's what's speaking. That's what's moving. And without, like, a grip on identity structure or a holding in any way, it's able to just be fluid always.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. It's very lovely. It just feels like a movement, a dance. It's just very, like, mm. I always find the word yummy here. It's just yummy.
It's like a tree swaying in the wind, a tree
Yeah,
that's firmly planted.
yeah,
And
yeah,
just
exactly.
yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
can you talk to me like what's the difference between self-help and awakening, or is there a difference between?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think traditionally self-help is sort of like, creating a healthier identity, healthier ego, which I think is really beautiful. I don't have any problem with it. I think it was a lot of my pregame, I guess, if you will, before non-duality, and I think that in some way, I don't know if I would have been able to let go as much as I have let go through non-duality without it. It's kind of hard to say that because it's not like I chose to have that Brennan pregame or anything. It's just how it unfolded, right? But it's in retrospect sort of seems like, an appropriate step sometimes for some people before, because I didn't have a healthy ego. I come from really terrible conditioning and really dense trauma. So to have a little bit more of a healthy ego before letting go of it was in, at least in my case, really important. So I think self-help is really beautiful. I think it's important, maybe if you're, say, on the awakening path and you're also delving into some sides of self-help, that it's important to recognize what it's really about and not get re-identified. Like, that's the tricky part there, but even without self-help, you can get re-identified with, like, ego can get re-identified very easily with non-dual practices or awakening or spiritual practices. So to me, it's the same difference in a sense. But yeah, self-help is purposely making you feel better, purposely maybe helping you work through emotions in different ways. And again, I think it's absolutely beautiful. And so the question was, what the difference between that and
Self-help and
non-duality
awakening.
and
Yeah.
awakening. Yeah. So that's self-help. And awakening is to go beyond ego, to go beyond what you take yourself to be, to go beyond the story. So you can say ego is a character if we're using it in this context, right? And so self-help is to maybe awaken the character, right? Maybe to make the character feel better, make the character live a more healthy life, and again, beautiful. But then awakening is to go beyond the character, is to see what is the nature of the character itself. What is all of this that the character seems to play out in? And so that's what I would say would be the difference between self-help and awakening. Awakening is beyond. It's and in the other way you can say it from an energetic standpoint is self-help is almost a healthier contraction, but it's still contracting further energetically. And awakening is to release that contraction, to self-help to frame more in a different way, and awakening to obliterate all frame, to let go of frame, to let go of orientation. Mhm.
That's beautiful.
Thanks.
And there's this idea of like subject and object. Can you explain that? I think that
Mm.
also bring clarity to that question too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, talking about orientation, it feels like one of the qualities of self identity structure, right? Not ego necessarily. I mean, it spills out into ego expression, but it's really more like that structure. Is that the base of the self structure is an orientation, and it has to kind of keep keep creating this subject object orientation, right? And so it's uh it's a movement of creating a objective world that I can be in subject to, or that something seems to be in subject to. So all day long there's orientation, myself and this call, myself and this work, myself and my life, myself and my day, right? You talk about falling into sleep, right? Letting go of that orientation into death. Sleep is absolute death, right? And then going from that, you wake up, your mind starts thinking first thing, right? How do I create myself as a subject into this objective world that I have to step into as I get out of this bed, right? And so like that function, I don't think there's a problem with it in and of itself, and there's a bit of like functionality to it, but when we're identified with it and it's not like a we that are identified with it or something that's identified with it, but when there is the mysterious identification with it, whatever
Yeah.
that is, it feels very obsessive in a way. It feels very fixed. It's a fixation, right? And so uh, awakening itself sort of eases up some of that orientation, but it's really not until, again, that self structure is more dismantled that that orientation kind of falls away. And a lot of the path unfolding to those two steps, if you will, um, there's a lot of times where you're disoriented, right? You go into spiritual practices, you go into awareness practices, or you go into different parts of this unfolding, and you're like, whoa, 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 I feel like I'm going to barf. I'm disoriented, right? And there's an energetic quality. So there's an orientation of mind that creates a subject object, but there's also a energetic contraction that creates this sense of subject object constantly. So when you start to go into some of these practices, you start to it feels like uneasy, right? Um, and it's normal. And I like to remind people that that's normal and that you can breathe into it and that what you actually are beyond self structure, your spirit, your essence, the energy of this is fine. It can handle disorientation. You know why? Because this is disorientation. There's nothing here that can orient to anything else. Even to say it's oneness is missing the point. There isn't orientation, and it's not the lack of orientation, it's not the opposite. It's defying logic of opposites, of anything polar, of anything binary. It's not non-orientation, but it's not orientation, right? It's somewhere where those two meet and they're seen energetically, felt that they're not two movements, actually. It's the feminine and masculine, it's the everything and the nothing, right? But those aren't really two movements. Um, but it's a path of sort of exploring both sides of those as the unfolding puts you in disorientation and orientation again and disorientation and everything and nothing and all of the beauty of that. But yeah, at some point it just is really energetic. It's like something in one sense is seen at some point to not really move from the center line where the two seemingly meet, even though there's not two meeting.
How's your like experience of like the five senses change? Because I think
Yeah.
maybe we reorient ourselves around the five senses a lot.
Mhm.
And so if
Yeah.
you're letting go and you're going into somewhat of a disorientation, maybe
Mhm.
things get zoomed out a little bit more, or maybe things. I mean, how's your experience of the five senses change? Five
Yeah.
senses change.
Yeah, beautiful question as well. Um, so I'm very neurodivergent in the sense of this brain is very dyslexic in the way it processes the world and very ADHD in the way it processes the world. So it has its unique through those conditioned expressions of how it processes the senses, which is the world, right? So for me, it's always felt very alive in the senses and very attention's been oriented to the senses for a really long time since I was really little because I couldn't process linear very easily and I couldn't process like conceptual understanding of reality as well. Like that was my challenge. And so I think by default, attention was more in the senses, which I think for most people it's the senses are not as open and the attention is in the conceptual reality, the reflective reality of things. So, um, awakening and what this path has beautifully changed in me here is that I always kind of knew that without the words because that was just where I naturally leaned into the senses. But I also was like leaning with hesitation into the senses because I believed that something was wrong with me because I was noticing people around me weren't. Like, I wanted to, like, rub against the wall and touch everything, like, and I didn't like, it would just, like, be perceived as the weird one by people. I could just tell how they were acting around me or even what they would say around me, adults when I was a child and so forth. Like, it was weird that I wanted to touch everything or that I was attuned in these type of ways. And so I believed a part of my identity was that there's something weird about that. Like it's not okay. Like visually, I was very visual and I would trace like somebody would be talking to me. And instead of like listening and following linearly what they're saying, because I couldn't, I was tracing their face, and I was just loving every little detail of, like, the movement of, like, all of the aspects of their face and what's going on in the visual field, and so then it was like they thought, like, I just didn't understand that, like, in school and stuff, they would interpret that, like, I just didn't have comprehension, I just couldn't understand, and logically, I couldn't, so if the teacher was telling me something, like, I would zone into the visual field, and I'd be like, I thought that was weird. I thought, "Oh, boy, I better never tell anybody that I'm doing that I'm tracing their face because I think that's weird." But they just thought I just like, I don't know. Their perception of it was something was off, which from that context, sure, something was off. But like now I just love it. And I realize that that that's not like I was just understanding it through a different language. I was so present. I was so there with them. I just wasn't understanding it through words. I was understanding it through the visual of what was the shapes and the colors and what was expressing there. So what this path has done for me is allowed me to really feel confident in moving into that, and it's opened up because that identity is not there. Because that hesitation identity of, oh, that's weird. That's a weird thing. And so it's kind of weird in a sense that a lot of teachers don't talk about the senses because it feels like that's where reality's happening. That's where it's always really been happening. But we're so stuck in this like background of reflection of what's really happening here. And the reflection is never really talking about anything happening here at all. Yet we have the capacity within the body mind to perceive reality directly through the senses. To me, that's freaking amazing.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you also been on like silent retreats. Tell me about that. Like
Mhm.
what do you do on those, and like,
Oh,
what are some cool
yeah,
stuff that happens?
yeah, totally. Silent retreat has been at least to a year since year 1, since I started on this path, and it's been almost 6 years, and I love them. There's, there's just so much to it. So there's times of it triggering because being around other people, triggering the unconscious tendencies and patterns in me, and I just look at them and feel them and process them however I need to. And then the later years have been a lot of the sensory exploration, seeing the subject object construct that can be built in the mind through visual field, through sound, where it feels like it's over there, it feels like it's being heard through this ear, or being seen that I'm something here and there's the world out there. And so it's really just in the last few years really deepened in exploring. I'll just sit for the week and explore one sense. The visual sense was really fun. The sound sense was really fun. I play sound meditation with multiple instruments, and so for the group, and that's really been a big part of my sound exploration. Where am I, and where's the sound, and where to me it started with I was just curious like it started at first feeling like I'm playing the music, that I'm a something playing the music energetically, even though I knew on the insight level that there wasn't someone here, but it still felt in its ways. And so it was retreat has been a beautiful at clarifying those parts of subject object that express through the senses, and to sort of obliterating that sense of dualistic there, and to where it started to become there was I felt like I was not a me watching, but it was like something was it was like I was watching my hands do their own thing, playing the bowls, playing the sound. And I was big crystal singing bowls that I play with. And it was like it reminded me of like Matilda. Have you ever seen that movie?
No, I haven't, but what happened in the scene?
Yeah, so in Matilda, she's got, like, this ability to move objects with her mind, and so she'll be like and it's very she's a little girl, and so she's in a family I really resonate with her just from my background, but she's in a family where they don't really her parents are just repressed and angry, and they don't really care about her. They have this brilliant little girl, but they just don't see her. And so she'll skip school, and while they're all off into school or work, her brother or her family, she's like finds this ability within her, and she's like moving the objects with her mind. So she's like singing and dancing in the kitchen and making pancakes, but she's not without her hands. She's just like stuff spinning in the air, almost like the other thing it reminds me of is what is that movie? Beauty and the Beast, where the objects have their own little movements
Uh-huh.
and personalities. And so I started to feel like that when I was playing the music, where it was just, I was like, it just didn't feel like my hand. It just was like I was watching a hand do this to play the sound meditation. Cause it's like you play it like this, right? So I was just watching my hands and my body do play these instruments. And I was like, wild. It was just so, yeah, a lot of different explorations through silent retreats for me.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. I
Yeah.
also like when I was going through certain awakenings too, like weird stuff like that would happen too, or like
Mhm.
I would wake up in the middle of the night and I'd wake up and my hand would just start raising like that. I'm like, then I kind of
Yeah.
snap back into like a smaller perception. I'm just like, wait a minute, what I just
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
weird.
Yeah.
But
Exactly. Yeah.
so
It's
like
beautiful.
with hearing, like so you got into like hearing your or hearing where the sound was from and things like that. Like,
Mhm.
was there anything? Do you feel like your hearing got better just being able to play with that, or like what kind of
Mm.
things did you
Um,
find out?
yeah, yeah. Well, I've always had a keen sense of hearing, so I could like hear things far, far away. I just have a really good hearing. I have terrible vision actually, but I have really good hearing for some reason. This body does at least. And I don't know that it's necessarily made that better, but it's more um I don't know, let me feel into it.
Hmm.
I think it's really just dissolved any sense of um objective reality and also any sense of locality. Like there's just it just doesn't feel like there's anywhere that hearing is coming from or the sound is coming from. It feels like they're sort of coming from the same place that can't be located. And that feels the same in all senses at this point for me.
So just
Mhm.
so it's kind of like your awareness has kind of is merged things together. Is that what it is? Way to describe it?
Yeah, I guess you could say that. It feels like synesthesia, like, I can understand through thought, reality, through mind that I don't know, like, there can be an understanding of the sound is coming from over there because that's the air conditioning, and it's being heard somewhere here, but it doesn't feel like that. Like, that to me is obvious that that's the overlay, and it also I can understand through sort of the thought reflection that the sound is different than the sensation, but energetically, experientially, it feels like synesthetic. It doesn't feel like I don't even know. I couldn't tell you what is the difference between a sound and a sensation or a visual field. There
Hmm.
just feels like the same energy moving.
And like during silent retreat, do you feel like you're connected with everybody else there? Like, does it
Mhm.
get very deep where like sometimes you can read people's thoughts, or what kind of like
Well, I don't know that
environment?
I necessarily read people's thoughts, but it does feel like as more and more identity is dropped away here, it feels like there's more of that receptivity of feeling people directly. And I don't know necessarily the interpretation of that. It just is felt and it's clear. And um, Mm, like, my mind isn't necessarily thinking, "Oh, I just felt Ezekiel's sadness because I walked by him." Like, my mind isn't necessarily thinking and reflecting it that way, but I can feel the energy in the room very clearly, for whatever's
Yeah.
going on, and it sort of it expresses through here, like, n now more so in the last couple years, it feels like it feels like it quickly kind of absorbs in this body and it moves from repression to expression, like, it finds its expression here, and it's kind of a really interesting and cool process, but it just feels like it finds its expression here. I don't know, maybe there's just more clarity in this system that allows for it to move through in some way. I don't know. I don't really think of it these reflections I'm saying now are sort of reflective
Mhm.
retrospect, but it's hard to talk about. Yeah.
Yeah, like I'm saying in that kind of frame because it's like
Uh-huh.
for the sake of communication, like, oh, can you read someone's thoughts? But it's kind of
Yeah.
like the thoughts are coming up on their own and they're kind of like happening in a very impersonal way. They're happening in this like you say space, if you
Yeah.
will.
I do
They're filling
feel
up.
yeah, yeah, and I do feel sometimes when I'm sitting with somebody one-on-one, that sometimes I'll have certain, certain thoughts or certain memories, or I'll be seeing a color or something like that, and I'll just like, as I'm working one-on-one with someone, I'll just tell them like, Do you see yellow?" if that's what I'm seeing. Do you see the school bus?" or "Do you see this?" like, whatever is coming up in my, visual memory, I guess, or visual perspective mind, I'll just ask them if they see that as well. And I don't necessarily think it necessarily comes from them or not, but it comes from the meeting of these two energies. And then there's oftentimes that they see that thought that I just had or something like that, if that helps understand that part. Yeah.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. It happens to me too. So
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you just become more receptive to being the field ultimately. It's not really a field, but for terminology purposes and explaining it, it's kind of can feel like there's a field where things arise and it's not your consciousness or my consciousness, it's one consciousness. So, yeah.
And then talk to me about attention. Like, what's important about attention and paying attention to maybe bodily sensations or stuff like that?
Mm, attention. What what I love in insight and reflection of attention exploration for me here is that when attention is free because it's not identified with storyline or mind identification, then it naturally goes towards that which needs it. And it doesn't have an operator. Like we couldn't, there's an experience, there can be a experience through thought that says move attention to your toes and then you feel your toes. But that isn't really somebody moving attention. It just sort of is that expression of somebody moving attention. It just sort of seems that way, right? But when attention isn't bound in thought and isn't confined through thought, then it has the ability to just naturally goes towards that which needs it. And that, so if there's a energy that's contracted and repression, emotion, if attention isn't bound in thought, it just like zooms into it on its own. And so that I find so beautiful and so powerful because when something is arising in the body, in the environment, attention goes towards it. It's very effortless. Um, but we have to be really clear and aware that most of the time that's not the case. Attention is bound in thought, reflection in some way, or bound in the body, stuck on some energy or emotion in some way. So it's important to work with attention. I think it's a beautiful, you work with attention through the sort of interface, I guess, if you will, is a good word for it, interface of it feeling like something moving attention to somewhere. So you work with attention in that way. I think it's important and helpful along the path until at some point it's seen that attention isn't being moved by someone or something and isn't outside of that something that needs it. But it's important to sort of use that interface while that interface is at play and not try to understand beyond it because eventually it will naturally you'll naturally in the insight will fall in will fall beyond it anyways. So starting where it feels like now, if it feels like that for someone, that attention is something I can move. And you just start there and you carefully use that interface to your advantage to move it to that which needs some movement. And then the other thing I'll say with that part is when attention is either directed through that interface of it feeling like someone's moving attention or something's moving attention, or through the interface of attention's moving itself, regardless, putting attention on an energy, a repressed emotion, a thought, anything is so valuable because there's a wisdom within that movement, within that energy, within that thought, within that emotion that actually knows how to move itself back to its equanimity, back to its pattern of movement that is contraction expansion, but it gets stuck in contraction. And so when something's stuck in contraction, you put attention on it, then you just see that it naturally moves its way back, but it kind of needs that attention. It really does. And so, attention is a beautiful tool, and the fact that it feels like we can move it is really a good thing.
Yeah, it's super lucid, super effortless. I mean,
Mhm.
just gotta follow the flow,
Yeah,
like watery.
totally, totally. Yeah, yeah.
And my final question here is gonna be, if you were to take if you were to take the world's attention, like a lot of people are focusing,
Mm.
or from a collective standpoint,
Mhm,
there's certain events in the world that are happening right now. People are focusing their attention there.
mhm.
If you were to take their attention and move it somewhere else, where would you take? What event would you take their attention from, and then move it towards a certain place? If that makes sense.
Yeah, I would suggest um, to move attention from external to internal. There really ultimately isn't an internal or external, but it doesn't matter. If it feels that way, then that's where we approach, right? And so attention, I think a lot of the suffering is this conditioned movement of attention going out. There's and going into these functions of like linear in some way, like, and it's the way that attention moves through mind identification ultimately is like there's something wrong out there. The world's a problem out there. But as we're beautifully exploring in this energetic sharing between the two of us right now, and in this last hour has been like through awakening, dissolving the subject object, dissolving the space and time and these type of things, right? That's what we're really touching on here in some way. And so attention going external is reiterating that belief that there's an internal or external. And so it's also reiterating that there's something wrong here, that attention, there's something wrong here, or there's something wrong out there. I'm stumbling a little bit here because there's just like, oh, we can have a whole hour on this one question. There's a lot to sort of unpack and clarify, but it's like ultimately what this is about, I feel, is changing that dynamic that's ingrained and really conditioned into the nervous system, into the body mind of attention external. There's a problem to fix. Even if there's a problem to fix here, I need to find something external from me to fix it. I need to get some help external to fix it, which is a beautiful movement in and of itself, but we're fixated on it as humans. We're fixating on it, and we're anything that we're seeing external as the world as a problem. And I'm not one to deny the world has its challenges and its problems. I'm all for that, but I think where that stems from ultimately is what I'm saying here is it stems from this misconception that I'm in here and I'm separate and there's something wrong with me. And therefore, because I believe that first misconception, everything I see is a reflection of that there's something wrong, that there is a right or wrong, right? So relatively sure, there's a right or wrong. I'm not denying that, but I'm talking a little bit deeper than that in the sense of there really isn't. There really isn't. And so it's not about holding a perspective on either of those sides, but it's to see the functioning of both expressions of that, both interfaces, right? And so it's the path of really changing the way attention moves from external to here. And I wholeheartedly know in the depths of my heart that this, like moving attention in this way, is what heals anything external, because it obliterates all identity, ultimately, all of obliterates, but also it insightfully shows what it really is, what those interfaces really are. Say, interface of subject object, interface of right or wrong, interface of anything dualistic, interface of mind identification. When you really know what that is and what is beyond it or before it, or what allows it to even be an expression, then it just changes the way your body mind moves through the world. And when you're not moving through the world with this identity of subject object, with this identity of separate belief, I'm someone separate, it changes. It just is a ripple that is beyond any understanding of words. It's very energetic, and it heals everything it touches.
Awesome.
Yeah. There's so much there. It's like I feel like if you were to ask me what is this Violet character doing in the world with being on a podcast with you or talking to YouTube and however I do, or talking to people, it feels like that's the movement of what we're shifting, is this orientation from moving from away from to moving towards everything.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, where can people find you?
Violet-synergy.com is my main website. My YouTube is Violet Synergy. And I have a book out that I just published this last week. That's called Untethered, a Dream Within a Dream. It's a non-dual poetry book, and that's on Amazon. And then I have a retreat online it's the very first synergy retreat that will be at the end of September. And all of that can be found on either the description of my YouTube video or on my website.
Where is it at?
The retreat will be online, and it will be synergy came to me when I first started speaking about this stuff. And so it's a retreat including a few different teachers. Angela will be there. Josh Putten, I don't know if you heard of him. He'll be there. A girlfriend of mine, which is actually, she's not a teacher, but she's in school to be a psychologist. She's very beautifully awake. She'll be there. Her name's Alma, and it will be it's a synergy of different teachers. It's a synergy of different modalities. We'll have silent meditation. We'll have movement. We'll have poetry. We will have Q&As. We'll have intuitive inquiry, which is most of the work that I do with people is in inquiring intuitively into that direct experience. So yeah, it will be a great retreat.
Well, awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much. It was just nice to meet you and just lovely to be in this energetic experience together.